The general election here in the UK is happening on July 4th, or funnily enough, Independence Day. And I thought it's a good time to look at what each party will mean for our investments. This may help you to make up your mind, but also be a good reflection of what we should expect from whoever wins the election. In my last two videos, I've tackled a lot of what we could expect to come from Labour, which does include speculating on what may happen, because let's face it, whoever gets in is going to be scrambling down the back of the sofa to find the money to fulfil their promises. And there's likely going to be much worse to come than what they're promising. I've had a lot of love and some hate on my previous videos, some calling them a Tory piece, and in actual fact I want to say I'm not voting Conservative this time. And I would presume I don't need to mention the fact we all know we're in an absolute state at the moment. Whether you blame the Tories or not, I feel like we don't need to point out the obvious. It's almost a certainty that Labour will be getting in come Thursday, but it's more interesting to me to look at what we may expect to come so we're not completely blindsided. But in this video, I want to do something a little different and compare what each of the parties are setting out to do and how it will affect us as investors. For the purpose of clarity, I'm going to be going off what they've said within their own manifestos. And I want to point out that just because it's in their manifesto doesn't mean it's binding, and it's only an indication of what they may do. I wish it was binding so we could at least know what we were getting if they had to stick to their words. So let's break down each of the key areas and look at what's been promised. Now, I hurt some people's feelings last time by just including the YouGov poll. So here's the data from both the BBC and the Financial Times. Of course, these are just an estimate. I really don't think there's much difference between Labour having a 40% majority and a 37% majority, but I will apologise for anyone that I upset. For ease and to keep this video shorter, I'm going to be excluding both the SNP and Plaid Cymru, as I believe these are much smaller in the polls and much more country specific. So for the purpose of this comparison, I'll be looking at Labour, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party, and yes, Reform UK. I will say that during my research of this campaign, I'm shocked how many sites have completely excluded Reform as a party, which seems a shame as I do believe in fair representation, whether you agree with them or not. And also, during this research, it's surprising how much is left out by big websites. I'm talking about big websites with huge reach. There's some saying there's no mention of something when it clearly outlines their plans were quite drastic in their own manifestos. So I've directly taken this from what they have said. I would have liked to see them all debate against each other in a fair environment, but it's no surprise that BBC aren't going to give much support to the party looking to abolish their TV licence fee. And what's been going on seems absolutely crazy. So let's avoid that minefield and look at what's actually been said in the key areas that affect us financially going forward. First, let's talk about tax, because this is what has the biggest impact on us and it's going to affect how much we have available to invest. Income tax is going to be the big one that affects us the most. None of the parties have any plans to raise income tax, as that would be such an unpopular policy, with a caveat. Because it's not raising income tax that's the issue, it's them not raising the thresholds in line with inflation. When they freeze the thresholds that we pay tax, rather than raising them in line with inflation, it increases tax as rising wages push greater numbers of workers into the tax system or onto higher rates. It's a trend known as fiscal drag. In each forecast, higher than expected earnings increase the numbers expected to be paying a higher rate of tax and the amount of tax that they pay. Data from the OBR shows that between 2022 and 2023 and 2028 and 29, this set of threshold freezes means that nearly 4 million additional people will be expected to pay income tax. 3 million more will have moved into the higher rate and 400,000 onto the additional rate. This represents an increase in the number of taxpayers in each band of income tax. 11% for the basic round, 68% for the higher rate, and 49% for the additional rate. This is a respective increase by 2028 of 830,000, 900,000, and 43,000. This set of freezes are now estimated to raise 42.9 billion and 44.6 billion by the end of the forecast, which is 1.4% of GDP. Frozen thresholds are the largest contributor to the rising overall economy-wide tax burden, responsible for almost a third, 4.5% of GDP increase in taxes from 2019 to 2028. So what does each party plan to do about it? The Conservatives plan to introduce a new pensioner personal allowance, increasing the triple lock guarantee from April 2025, which will save around £100 for 8 million pensioners, rising to £270 per year by the end of Parliament. This is a new scheme, while Labour and the Lib Dems also plan to protect the existing triple lock that's in place. The triple lock is a commitment to increase state pensions by whichever is highest of average earnings growth, CPI inflation, or 2.5%. The triple lock, along with the introduction of the new state pension, has increased the value of the state pension relative to earnings to a level not seen since 1980, when the policy of operating in line with earnings was ended. From a peak of 26% in 1979, the value of the basic state pension as a percentage of average full-time earnings fell to around 16% between 2000 and 2010. Following the introduction of the triple lock, the value of the basic state pension increased from 16.8% to 18.8% of earnings by 2022. The new state pension was worth 24.5% of earnings in 2022, a slight increase from 24.1% when it was introduced in 2016. In March 2023, the Department for Work and Pensions, the DWP, forecasts that the total state pension expenditure in 2023 will be £124.3 billion. The triple lock has increased the value of the state pension, leaving pensioners better off than they would have been otherwise. However, concerns have been raised about its sustainability in the long term, particularly in light of the recent economic volatility which has accelerated spending. The OBR, or the Office for Budget Responsibility, has identified the triple lock as a fiscal risk. This is due to its upward ratcheting effect, which leaves the public finances exposed to higher pension costs. This one I think is good news for pensioners and perhaps us when we actually get there, but it's an expensive cost which will only grow into the future. Whether it's sustainable or not, we'll have to see. Labour haven't mentioned anything to do with the income thresholds. The Liberal Democrats said they would cut income tax by raising the personal allowance when public finances allow it. The Green Party have said, and I quote, they're committing to no increases in basic rate of income tax during this cost of living crisis. No mention of the higher rate taxpayers, which is a little scary. And Reform's policy is likely the most impactful here, raising the minimum tax threshold from £12,570 to £20,000, and the higher rate from £50,000 to £70,000. And when finances allow, they would introduce a 25% transferable tax allowance, meaning no tax on the first £25,000 of income for either spouse. These would be pretty huge, but how expensive they would be is another question. Definitely on the more radical side out of the bunch on income tax. Hand in hand with income tax is national insurance. The Conservatives are suggesting a 2% cut in national insurance from 6% in April 2027, which they say would save £1,350 for a worker on £35,000, and they would get rid of the main rate of national insurance for the self-employed by the end of Parliament. Labour have no plans to increase national insurance, and that's what they've said. Lib Dems have no mention of it, only they will aim to make it fairer. And the Green Party would remove the reduced national insurance for higher earners, and they quote, they feel that the tax rate should not fall as income increases. Reform plan to increase national insurance to 20% for foreign workers. They say this would incentivise British businesses to employ British workers because their national insurance rate would stay at 13.8%. I definitely understand Reform's thinking on this one, but I hope it wouldn't discourage us from getting essential staff we need from overseas where we already have shortages. We do have fair wages in this country in the sense of it's not like we're paying a foreign employee less than a British one. At least I would like to think that's the case. I'm not overly convinced we would be bringing them all here if we didn't need them, but that's open to debate. In terms of cost savings to us, likely Conservatives would be best here, with the Greens being the most expensive for higher earners. Capital gains tax is the next one that will affect the majority of us at some point throughout our lives. The Conservatives are suggesting to implement tax relief for landlords if they sell their property to existing tenants, seemingly in a bid to get more people into home ownership. Labour want to close a loophole where performance-related pay in private equity industries is treated as capital gains rather than income tax, which to me seems pretty fair. The Lib Dems want to close loopholes they feel are being exploited by the super wealthy, raise the allowance to $5,000, which would be better for normal people. Remember, until recently it was $12,300 per person, which has now been stripped right down to £3,000, which seems awfully low. They also want to introduce relief for small businesses and increase rates to 20, 40 and 45% so it would be in line with income tax, generating a suggested revenue of $5.2 billion. Green have said that they would bring capital gains tax in line with income tax and say it would only affect 2% of income tax payers, and Reform have no mention of it in their manifesto. It would be so much easier if they all had to give their stance on key areas so we could clearly see where they all stand, but hey ho. I think closing some of these loopholes definitely seems fair. It's unfair that only a few can get away some of these to pay less tax, and the mass majority of us have no choice. The Lib Dems increase is nice to see too, and something I wish others would also consider. A nominal rate of capital gains tax is nice for us all to benefit from at some point. I suppose the counter argument is that some people are able to take advantage of it every year, while for most of us it might be once in a blue moon. Next is another tax, which affects us all in different ways, which is VAT. The Conservatives plan to keep it at the £90,000 they had already established, which was good of them to do, although we would have liked to see a larger rise in line with rising inflation. Labour plan to charge VAT to private school fees, which has caused quite a bit of controversy, mainly around those parents who will now be priced out and the demand on public schools. I don't think many people feel too sorry for the ones that it won't mean a lot to financially. Now, the Liberal Democrats have an interesting one. They want to scrap VAT on children's toothbrushes and toothpaste to encourage children to brush their teeth. They also want to cut VAT to 5% on public charging for electric vehicles, and they'll remove VAT exemption for private first class and business class lights. Green is also in favour of the VAT fees for private schools, and they say that they would propose a range of changes to VAT, reducing it on hard-pressed areas such as hospitality and the arts, and increasing it on financial services and private education. Let's hope that doesn't include core financial education type services or investing platforms that people need. They would also look to remove or reduce VAT on renewable energy installations, not a surprise for the Greens, which I would personally like to see a bit more of. And also, which I think is quite interesting, they want to remove VAT on things like cultural events, which includes everything from theatre to museum tickets to gigs in local pubs, which I think could be pretty nice. Reform would reintroduce the VAT refund scheme for tourist shopping, which they claim has cost the economy over $10 billion. And perhaps their most dramatic of their suggestions is to scrap VAT on energy bills, which they say would save households £500 per year. And I'll also throw in there they would lower fuel duty by 20p, which would be a welcome change by most. They also want to lift the VAT threshold to $150,000, which I think would be a welcome change for small businesses. They've also suggested VAT relief in the social care system, as well as, in contrast to the others, keeping the 20% relief on independent schools, as they think that relief can ease the strain on public schools. There's some interesting changes on this one. I think reforms would probably be the most impactful for us as a person. Think about the private schools, but I do think also the policy about removing VAT on things like museum tickets and local gigs would be great for communities. This one's definitely highlighted some areas that are quite interesting. Next up is corporation tax, which is integral to businesses both small and large. Conservatives have no plans to increase corporation tax, although they have said at least not for small businesses, which could mean they do increase it for larger companies. Labour will cap corporation tax at the current level of 25%, the lowest in the G7 for the entire Parliament, which is good. And they say they will act if tax changes in other countries pose a risk to the UK competitiveness. The Lib Dems plan to tackle avoidance on this issue by working with partners in international forums, including the OECD and the UN, to tackle international corporate tax avoidance for the benefit of all countries and make the case for increasing global minimum rates of corporation tax to 21%. Green, surprisingly, doesn't mention corporation tax in their manifesto. Reform plan to, and I quote, free over 1.2 small and medium-sized businesses from paying corporation tax by lifting the minimum threshold to 100k. They also want to reduce the main corporation tax rate from 25% to 20% and then to 15% from year 3. I really like the reform policy on this one in particular. It would be huge for small business growth. Although again, how expensive some of these changes could be is a real question. It's nice to see none of the parties are planning, at least for now, to increase it. Inheritance tax is another one that's caused quite a fuss. The Conservatives, Labour and the Lib Dems have no mention of it in their policies, which isn't amazing. It would be so much better if they said their stance on it, because it does raise red flags on what possibly could happen that hasn't been mentioned, and it has circulated a lot of rumours about all the parties. The Green Party have said that they would reform inheritance tax, ensuring that intergenerational transfers of wealth are taxed more fairly. So we can presume we would see some increases and maybe less likely some reductions. Reform are planning to abolish inheritance tax for all estates under £2 million. That means 98% of all estates. The rate above £2 million will be 20% tax, with the option to donate to charity instead. It's quite a sensitive subject, as for most of us, we feel like we shouldn't be paying tax to pass on our estates we've already paid tax on our entire lives. Not a huge amount of clarity here from the others. Hopefully that means they don't plan to touch it. It would have just been nice to have that clarity added. Another interesting debate around this election has been tackling tax avoidance, which all parties seem quite keen on. The Conservatives are planning to tackle tax avoidance and evasion, raising an estimated £6 billion per year by the end of Parliament, in what they say is over 200 measures that they've already implemented. Labour are planning to tackle tax avoidance by modernising HMRC and increase registration and reporting requirements and strengthen HMRC's powers, and focus on large businesses, estimating a £5 billion saving. Hopefully not too much hassle for us self-employed. I have a feeling this will mean completing a declaration a lot more often than once a year, most likely quarterly. Lib Dems is fairly similar. They want to narrow what they claim is a £36 billion tax gap by investing an extra £1 billion a year into HMRC to improve support and compliance and anti-avoidance activities, suggesting a revenue of £7.2 billion. Green also want to strengthen HMRC while focusing on making sure larger corporations pay their fair share of tax. Reform have stated they want to improve HMRC staffing and management to address failure to collect tens of billions of taxes, as well as complaining that they want to stop the offshore taxpayer rip-off. And they said some larger care home providers are avoiding tax on hundreds of millions of profits through complex offshore property company structures and high-interest shareholder loans, and they said this has to end. They all seem to be pretty focused on HMRC, and we could see more regular reporting for all. I hope the focus here will be more on the larger corporations and closing loopholes, and not more cost for the smaller guys and more hassle, but we'll have to see. Stamp duty is the next one that will affect all of us at one point or another in our lives. The Conservatives want to increase the threshold for first-time buyers from $300k to $425,000 before they start paying stamp duty, with no plans to increase it for anyone else. Labour haven't mentioned a change for anyone other than increasing the rate of stamp duty surcharge paid by non-UK residents, which I think is pretty good. Lib Dems have a similar policy to Labour and wanting to add a surcharge. Green Party have no mention of it, and reforms is pretty drastic in comparison. They want to cut residential stamp duty substantially by cutting stamp duty down to 0% below 750k and cut it to 2% from 750k to 1.5 million and cut it to 4% over 1.5 million, which could mean quite a big saving for everybody. Council tax is another area that's come under a lot of scrutiny. The Conservatives have said that under the family home tax guarantee, we will not increase the number of council tax bans or undertake an expensive council tax revaluation or cut council tax discounts, with a lovely dig at the end, as Labour is currently doing in Wales. Labour have not mentioned it in their plans. I would assume that they would bring England in line with Wales and go off 2003 values of properties rather than 1991, but they haven't said anything. The Lib Dems have quite a big one here, giving councils the ability to increase council tax by up to 500% where homes are being bought as second homes. This one's likely to give local authorities the ability to put people off buying up areas where locals need homes and are priced out of the market. This has been particularly pressing, especially in certain areas of Wales. Everybody is buying a holiday home and the locals can't buy. Green have said that the Green Party has always opposed council tax, which is a regressive tax that shifts the emphasis away from a local tax on property. They want what they say is a fairer system for taxing landowners. They said our long-term policy aim is a land value tax, so those with the most valuable largest land holdings would contribute the most. They want a re-evaluation of council tax bans to reflect big changes in value since the 1990s. They want to remove business rate relief on enterprise zones, free ports, petrol stations and most empty properties. And they want a survey of all land holdings to pave the way for fair taxation of land. Reform have made no mention of council tax in the manifesto. Before we hop into investment specifics, there's a couple of other special policies which only apply to certain parties. In these cases, the other parties haven't mentioned these specific policies, which isn't to say they won't do them, but it isn't in their manifestos. So from the Conservatives, we've got 30 hours of free childcare a week up to when they start school, but that's in England only. Labour want to abolish non-dom status completely to stop people avoiding paying tax in the UK. The Lib Dems want to give each parent 6 weeks of use it or leave it leave, as well as 46 weeks of parental leave that they can use between the two partners. Greens will push for a wealth tax. This will tax the wealth of individual taxpayers with assets above 10 million at 1% and assets above 1 billion at 2% annually. In their own words, only a very small minority of people would be subject to the wealth tax, while the overwhelming majority would benefit. Reform, I'm sure you don't need me to mention, will freeze non-essential immigration, as well as perhaps a radical idea of giving NHS patients a voucher if they can't see a GP within 3 days. For a consultant, it would be 3 weeks, for an operation, 9 weeks, and they say services will always be free at the point of use. So that's the stuff I think will mostly affect our money. There's more details of each specific policy, but I won't go too specific on that. Let's talk about the actual investment side of things. Now, in terms of ISAs, the word ISA was actually mentioned a whopping 0 times across all of the manifestos, so we're left in the dark on that one. It would have been really nice to see something regarding the British ISA or the lifetime ISAs, or some kind of simplification of the system. We could assume that means nothing will happen, but it does unfortunately, I feel, leave them all open to interpretation. So nothing on that for now. If that does change, I will let you know as soon as I do. So if you aren't already, make sure you subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss it. Pensions, however, we do have some changes coming, and here are the most noticeable ones that will affect us. The Conservatives are planning no new tax changes on pensions and said they will maintain the 25% tax-free lump sum. Labour have said that Labour will also act to increase investment from pension funds into UK markets. We will adopt reforms to ensure that workplace pension schemes take advantage of consolidation and scale, to deliver better returns for UK savers and greater productive investment for UK PLC. We will also undertake a review of the pensions landscape to consider what further steps are needed to improve pension outcomes and increase investment in the UK markets. The Lib Dems have said that they will require pension funds and managers to show that their pension portfolios are consistent with the Paris Agreement, which essentially means ensuring that pension funds are investing in green companies or companies with a focus on climate change. Greens have 2 big changes. The first is to make pension funds remove fossil fuels from their assets by 2030, and the second is to lower pension tax relief to 20% from 40% for the higher rate earners. A pretty big blow to the higher rate taxpayers utilising pension contributions. They say this would help pay for social care. Reform wants to review pension provision. They say that the current system is riddled with complexity, huge cost and poor returns, leading to less uptake. Countries like Australia do savings and pensions much better and cheaper and do it from a much younger age. They also have plans around infrastructure which could impact pensions. They say that the British taxpayer needs to be in control of Britain's utilities, launch a new model that brings 50% of each equity into public ownership. The other 50% would be owned by UK pension funds, benefiting from new expertise and better management. These changes for me are quite mixed. Personally, and perhaps selfishly, I don't want them to lower the pension threshold contribution to 20% for the higher rate. Honestly, when you look at the stats, the vast majority of the nation don't have enough in their pensions as it is. I don't think we should be discouraging people from putting money into their pensions. It would also tighten the gap between the ISA and the SIP, and more people would lean towards the ISA, which of course they get no tax money from whatsoever. The glaring problem from all of these is forcing pension funds to have UK-based assets. If we compare, for example, the S&P 500 to the FTSE 100 or FTSE 250, you can see the huge difference in performance. Personally, what needs to happen is much more control. Everyone should be allowed to have the pension in their own low-cost index tracker that tracks the global markets and matches the stock market's performance, not to be forced into some worse-performing option. It shouldn't be the job of an ordinary person to prop up UK companies using their pension by any means, in my view, especially at their expense. There's a couple of other party-specific policies which I think are quite interesting. The Lib Dems are proposing a 4% tax on share buyback schemes of FTSE 100 listed companies to incentivise productive investment, job creation and economic growth. The idea would be to get them to reinvest in the company rather than buying back shares. They suggest this would generate a revenue of $1.4 billion. This is based on a similar policy in the USA from the Biden administration and seems a bit strange. It's been criticised by senior economists who said that they would be surprised if a 4% tax raised much revenue at all. To a large extent, I would expect companies to just stop using share buyback schemes and just pay dividends instead if they wanted to return the money to shareholders. There's no clear justification for the policy. It's an interesting idea they tried to come up with, but there's so many factors at play into this, like the fact we hold most of our investments in ISAs and SIPPs, where we're not applicable to tax on those dividends. And here in the UK, we own quite low amounts of UK equities compared to the world, where, for example, in the USA, they own a lot more of US companies, which is understandable. I would simply just see them distributing cash as dividends instead. And the Green Party want to make a change to the FCA. The Financial Conduct Authority will develop targets to eliminate all equities relating to fossil fuel exploitation from the UK stock market, and will immediately prohibit the issuing of new shares for those purposes. No surprise here, really, from the Green Party. Energy currently makes up 12.9% of the FTSE, and it'd be interesting to see what effect this would have, but energy tends to do well in times of high inflation, but that may change when and if the new proposed windfall taxes are introduced on them, suggested by Labour and the Lib Dems. And if Labour do set up Great British Energy, this could also have a huge impact on the energy sector if it goes ahead. So there could be a lot of turbulence in that sector going forward. I think, having read through these manifestos multiple times, I created this comparison. What I find sad almost is how all of this just divides people so much depending on your personal circumstance and views. If I was to look at this at just a surface level view, Reform's policies would give me the most financial gain personally, regardless if you were to agree with their other policies or not. How viable you think that is open to interpretation. It's clearly not the only factor we need to consider, as it's much more complex than that. Can you imagine if you could just cherry pick, or we could just vote on each of these policies that we believed in as a nation, as I think most of us would agree? And I think, if I'm completely honest, I probably feel like most of you. I don't want to vote for the Conservatives, I don't really want to vote for Labour, and I just feel kind of lost in the middle, and I don't really like any of them. Can you imagine if these parties, instead of poking holes and bickering at one another, actually work together to achieve something? It all seems like such a big waste of taxpayers' money to me. No matter what happens, we'll get through it, and as always, I will do my best to keep you updated as things progress. I put these side by side as I want you to have as much transparency and material as you can. Please do go ahead and read the manifestos yourself so you can fully understand it and make up your own mind. And most of all, let's be kind to one another. If you want to take some steps that could help to improve your finances, then this video right here could help. Thanks.